It's been a while, chat. It's actually been a while since we've talked about the TCG format and made tier lists for it. We're gonna talk about the current TCG format a little bit as also like preparation kind of for YCS Bologna, which is happening in 2.5 weeks. The TCG is in an interesting state right now that we haven't had in a while. And I think the most important thing to realize, which is also, I think, a very interesting thing to look at, is the development that we've had within the format. This was, I would argue, the first really meaningful event of the current format, which was the first big YCS after, what's the current set even called? It's not Phantom Nightmare, it's the one before that. Age of Overlord. Pre-Age of Overlord, we had this, people are calling it cats and dogs format because of Unchained and Pearly. We had Tearlaments with a huge showing at YCS Dortmund, some Branded, some Chimera, those kind of decks, right? Age of Overlord dropped, and it kind of dropped Rescue Ace onto the scene, and it performed really, really well at YCS Indianapolis. At the time, I thought that Rescue Ace was going to be like the new hot thing in the format and potentially even take the format away from like a super diverse kind of situation and take the top spot because of how convincing its performance was at YCS Indianapolis, right? Then, moving on to YCS Richmond, we had this spread all of a sudden. We still had Rescue Ace in there, but at a much lower rate than previously. We had Unchained and Tearlament taking the 2 top spots in top 32. We had Infernoble breaking into the top 32 at a decent percentage, honestly. And we had Labyrinth coming back as well. Before we hop into a current meta tier list, I want to talk a little bit about why this sort of development happened. Like, why did Age of Overlord come out? Rescue Ace performs incredibly well at YCS Indy, and then the next YCS, just 2 weeks after, suddenly it appears to just go in a completely different direction, where Rescue Ace is part of the format but not dominant anymore, and other decks are taking over again. And I think that is a very important thing to look at because it explains a lot of how Yu-Gi-Oh! Meta shifts work and how you as a player can adapt to it, because honestly it's very important to be ahead of the curve in these sort of situations. For example, before YCS Indy, it would have been important to realize, hey, Rescue Ace is really good for this event. And then before YCS Richmond, maybe it was important to realize Rescue Ace is not going to be good for this event anymore. But why was that, and how do you recognize these sort of patterns, right? I feel like a good way to look at it is putting yourself in the position of someone who has played YCS Indy, or at least observed the results of YCS Indy, and is now preparing for YCS Richmond. The results of YCS Indy are of course greatly gonna influence their decisions going into YCS Richmond, right? If you're seeing this breakdown, you're gonna adjust your deck accordingly, or maybe even choose your deck accordingly when going into the next YCS. The 2 most obvious options for everybody after YCS Indy was either to play Rescue Ace because it performed so well, right? Which is something that a lot of people tend to do that, right? They see a deck win an event or put up 37.5% of top 32 and they're like, okay, well, this seems to be the best deck, I'm gonna play it. I'm not saying this is wrong, by the way. This can be wrong, it can also be correct, but that is one option that people have. The other option that people always have is they can keep playing what they're playing but adjust it to the current metagame. Or maybe they played Rescue Ace before, but they're like afraid that people are going to prepare for it, so they switch to something else and simply prepare for other people playing Rescue Ace. Because one thing that people don't always love is when I'm playing Rescue Ace, I might not love the fact that everyone else is also playing Rescue Ace, because I'm playing what's expected and I'm playing a lot of mirror matches, which depending on the deck can be really good or can be close to 50-50, right? And so what happened after YCS Indy is that people realized Rescue Ace was a really big deal and they prepared accordingly for it. And I think Rescue Ace single-handedly changed the format from what used to be a very board breaker heavy format into a big hand trap format. Because what people realized after YCS Indy is that Rescue Ace boards cannot realistically be broken with regular board breaker approaches, right? Because before, when it was like a lot of Unchained and Pearly, you would play like Tactics, you would play Thrust, and then for your Thrust target you had Herald of the Abyss, so you could out the X Purely Noir. A really huge part of the format before Rescue Ace was just playing board breakers, right? I would say the format before Age of Overlord was pretty much ruled by Talons and Thrust. Those were the big 6 that most people played, either all 6 in the main deck or 4 or 5 of them in the main and some more in the side deck, right? Like, but those cards were everywhere before Age of Overlord. And that also explains why Rescue Ace performed so well, because the majority of the player base, when it comes to realizing that the current thing is exploitable or not good anymore, usually people are late to that. So a lot of people entered YCS Indie, I think still with a lot of thrust and talents and so on in their main deck, and then Rescue Ace came into the format and just basically feasted on that. I did not test for YCS Indie because I didn't play the event, so I wasn't super into the format. At first glance, it looked like Rescue Ace was going to be vulnerable to certain board breakers, right? Like people said like, oh, the deck is really weak to Evenly. The deck is really weak to Lightning Storm. And that seemed like it was true if you don't look at it too deep, right? If you don't look at it in too much detail, then you might not realize that that is actually not the case. And I think that's what people learned the hard way a lot at YCS Indie, because the deck actually doesn't lose to Lightning Storm or Evenly or whatever, because the Rescue Ace setup simply always includes some sort of answer to those cards, right? And so what we noticed at YCS Indie is that most people that did well did not rely on board breakers, and instead they would use a decent amount of hand traps. And that is a phenomenon for Rescue Ace specifically. Rescue Ace is a deck that can lose to hand traps, but it doesn't really lose to board breakers, right? And whenever you have a deck that does this, you kind of force people to adapt to it. And that is what happened after YCS Indie. People saw 37.5% Rescue Ace. They realized you can't stop that deck with board breakers consistently. Otherwise, you just lose to the Rescue Ace setup. If you let Rescue Ace play, you probably lose to it. That forced people to play hand traps. That is something I don't think can be overstated of how much of an impact decisions like this have on the format, on the metagame. Because if suddenly everyone is playing 9, 12, 15 hand traps, if you're playing Rescue Ace, you're very often just gonna have to pass your first turn without doing that much. And the most important other thing is that decks that are notoriously good against hand traps start to rise again, Unchained and Tier. Because if we think back for a moment, there was a good reason that before Rescue Ace was popular, people played Thrust, Talents, and so on and so forth against, for example, Unchained. That was the best non-engine against Unchained. You would just let them do their thing and then just Talents them or Thrust them or Change of Heart or whatever, right? And then you had a good shot at playing the game. Tear Elements is kind of the same thing, right? Tear Elements isn't weak to a lot of the hand traps in the format, so like it just keeps playing through them, and you would be better off just keeping all your cards in hand and going second and trying to break their boards with solid non-engine, right? And so this is where we're at right now. The question is, how do you respond to a situation like this? Are we going back and forth now between people play a lot of hand traps, Unchained is the best deck, and then we go to people play low amounts of hand traps, and then Rescue Ace is the best deck again? Is that just something we have to flip-flop back and forth between? Because how else are you going to do it, right? By that logic, if you want to make a prediction like this, you should just go ahead and counter Unchained for YCS Bologna, for example, and then Rescue Ace is going to come out on top again, right? So the question is basically, what's going to happen after this? Right now, I think people are somewhat in agreement, and I am inclined to also somewhat agree that hand traps to some extent are necessary. I feel like we've reached a critical mass of decks in the format that you need hand traps against, because it is not just Rescue Ace, it is also Infernoble, the Mikanko deck, it's Manadium. There are a couple of decks that I would not feel comfortable playing no hand traps against, or just Ash or whatever. I think the reality of things is that right now we are in a format where people are going to play hand traps, and the decks that perform the best with and against hand traps are going to have better chances. It depends also on the number of hand traps that people are playing, because if people are playing like 9 hand traps, for example, they open like 1 to 2 on average, and there are decks that can definitely play through one hand trap. Like Rescue Ace with a larger Diabellstar package can definitely play through hand traps a decent amount. So people might just try and do that. For now, I just wanted to use this as kind of an introduction and explanation, because we're going to do a tier list in a second for the current format. This is my thought process on the current format, is that I wouldn't recommend playing decks without hand traps and completely focusing on board breakers, because there are too many decks that need to be hand trapped. A situation like this one is relatively tough. The way I'm saying these things might make it sound like there is a 100% good solution to this problem, but the reality of things is, when you go into an event right now, you're gonna face both sides of the coin, basically. You're gonna face the decks that board breakers are good against, and you're gonna face the decks that hand traps are good against. And there's really no way around it. So what you as a player have to do is basically you have to make a prediction of what you're gonna face more. Basically, basically what decks perform best in an environment like this, which I agree is a hard thing to predict. But the reality of things is basically what you're gonna do in a format like this one. I think you should try to not overcomplicate it, which might seem tough. You need to decide what you want to focus on in your main deck and then use your side deck to make up for what you didn't cover in your main deck. Like, as an example, if I decide to play a decent chunk of hand traps in my main deck because I think it's necessary in the format right now, I'm gonna have by default a better matchup against, for example, Rescue Ace and Infernoble and Mannadium than I'm gonna have a matchup against Unchained, right? My main deck is gonna be better against the decks that hand traps are good against. So what you want to do in that situation is you want to use your side deck to make up for that weakness. You probably want to make it so that, yeah, maybe I'm gonna lose game 1 to Unchained if they play through my hand traps. That sucks. I need to make sure that my side deck is ready for that and has a solution for Unchained after siding, right? Because in a very simplified situation, let's say Unchained goes first game 1, you have a hand trap or 2, but they play through it, they win the game. You are supposed to win game 2 because you are allowed to go first, and then game 3 you want to be prepared for them going first. You don't want to, for example, have like 15 hand traps in your main deck and then you side like 12 more just to go all in because you say like, it's a hand trap format, I need 27 hand traps total, right? Because then you're going to be over prepared for the decks that hand traps are good against, and you're going to be underprepared for the decks that hand traps are not good against. The opposite of this was what happened last format, right? Last format, before Age of Overlord, everyone was playing Thrust Talents in their main deck, and they simply sided for the matchups where you needed a lot of hand traps, right? They sided the Drolls and the Nibs. They were in all the side decks, right? And Shifter also, right? That's what people thought was better. They would go main deck Board Breakers for the more common matchups, and then side deck hand traps for the less common matchups. I think right now, obviously it depends on your deck, but I would expect the format to be hand trap heavy, which I think is correct. I don't think there's a way out. I don't think you can 5-head it at this point in time and just say, hey, screw it, I'm gonna make a meta call and play no hand traps. That doesn't seem realistic to me to work because there's still gonna be too much Rescue Ace, Infernoble, Mannadium, Mikanko, that kind of stuff, right? So I don't know if that's a winning approach. I think at this point you just have to like bite the bullet and be like, yeah, it's a hand trap format, so I'm gonna find what works best in that circumstance. That is where we're at right now. And now let's talk about these decks, because we also have some new faces on the block with Valiant Smashers. We have 3 new theme decks that could or could not have an impact on the metagame, and we're going to start with those 3 just to get them out of the way. I don't want to waste too much time on it. Valmonica and Memento at this stage are not ready to be played competitively. Maybe you can have some success and fun at locals with them, but I don't see how they become functioning decks in the competitive environment as of now, unfortunately. I think Centurion is a deck that is decently well positioned in this format, which is why I'm going to put it into the tier 1.5, which is the category I'm using to describe decks that I think are good, but I'm not sure how good exactly they are. They might end up being better than this. They might end up flopping a little bit. I think Centurion is solid, mainly because it is a deck that has a lot of non-engine slots, which means you can play the deck with a lot of hand traps if you want to. That being said, the reason why I'm not putting it higher on the list and the reason why I'm not sure it's going to perform super well is because right now Centurion is focused around 1-card combos, which all lose to 1 hand trap, right? Of course. The thing is, if both players are on a lot of hand traps, which seems to be the case right now, which deck comes out on top? I am not sure if Centurion ends up on top a lot of the time, but sometimes it does because the deck has solid ways to grind. There's also, I think, a lot of potential in experimentation with different combinations because the Centurion engine is so small. It's only like 13, 14 cards pretty much. People have been trying to play it with the Resonator cards. People have been trying to play it with Horus cards. Maybe that's the solution. Maybe that's how you play through an Imperm on your Primera. If you just have a Horus in the back of your hand, then you might just be able to still make a level 12 synchro and play from there, right? That could be one way to make the deck viable into a hand trap heavy format. Couple of things that are good about this deck outside of being able to play a lot of non-engine is also that it's good against some of the hand traps in the format. Cards like Valor, Imperm are good against it, but cards like Nibiru and Droll are not, which are also in a lot of people's decks, right? And Centurion doesn't really care about them. One problem with the deck is that the price is higher than what you get for it. It's kind of like the Vanquish Soul issue. It was just too expensive for what it did, and I think Centurion might have a similar problem. I don't like Branded very much. similar to, I think Branded Chimera is a little bit better than that, but also not much higher than this. That might be personal bias. I've never been a big fan of these decks recently. Whenever I've played against them, they didn't seem that strong. Whenever I played them, they didn't seem that strong. They are playable, but I don't think they are like a good solution to the format. It's better than Centurion? I don't think so. I actually don't think so. Dragon Link is in a solid position, I would say. It has a couple of matchups where the Bystials are really nice. Most notably, of course, Unchained and Tyr, which are the two most topping decks from the recent YCS. Dragon Link against hand traps, it seems weird in that regard. Like some hands play through like 3 hand traps, some hands lose to 1. Specifically, Droll and Nibiru can be problematic, I think, but if you practice your lines, you can probably get around them. Dragon Link is a solid deck right now. I don't think it's ideal into Nib and Droll, but other than that, it's well positioned. That's why I'm not putting it into Tier 1. Exo Sister is somewhere around here. It's got solid room for non-engine. You can play a lot of hand traps in it. Yeah, your 1-card combos also lose to a hand trap, but the deck has a lot of possible extenders, right? The grind game is all right. It gets to play Shifter. I'm not a huge fan of the deck. I'm putting it relatively low, but it still is Tier 2, I think. And the same goes for Fluandereeze. I think Fluandereeze, because it gets to play Shifter, is all right. I just think Fluandereeze is really, really bad into the amount of hand traps that people are playing. Yes, you don't care about Nibiru, but one of the most common hand traps right now, next to obviously Ash and Imperm, is also Effect Veiler. So people already have 9 ways to stop your birds. People are playing Droll. I mean, of course, Dimension Shifter stops both Veiler and Droll, so that is something. Maybe it's better than Exosister, probably. We have Infernoble, which is a deck that I'm gonna put here. I'm gonna withdraw from this discussion. It looks strong from the outside to me, but I haven't tried it enough myself yet to really judge it. It performed really well at YCS Richmond, which was something I didn't have on my radar. But some players like Pack played it and performed really well at the event with it. They main decked like 12 hand traps, and Pack said something along the lines of Infernoble is really good at beating like half boards. Like when you hand trap your opponent once or twice, they still end on something, but the deck is really good at beating that something. Like it can't beat full boards going second, but it can beat like the half boards that people make after being hand trapped. That would be somewhat ideal in a format like this, because I haven't played it as much as these people have. I'm just gonna take their word for it, and I mean the results speak for themselves. The deck seems to be performing in this current environment. Cash Tira, I don't even know why I still have this. It did top the most recent YCS. I'm gonna put it here, but I'm gonna say a thing or two. Maybe there is a world where you can play a Cash Tira deck that has just a billion hand traps and you just have a lot of 1-card combos. We all know how strong cards like Fenrir are. When both players throw hand traps at each other, that one Fenrir that just sits there ruins your day, right? Getting to play a deck that has the most access to Fenrir possible and play a lot of hand traps, like I don't know if that's good enough ever, but I guess that would be a way to play the deck, right? I'm gonna rate Lab not the highest Tier 1, but I'm gonna put it in Tier 1. I think Lab is solid right now because Lab kind of exploits certain developments in the format. What is interesting about Lab is that it doesn't really care about the Rescue Ace back row as much, because you just set your traps and pass back. They don't have great interaction with your back row. They only have a lot of interaction with monsters. And Lab, for the most part in game 1, is gonna have a good time against cards like Droll, cards like Nibiru, even Effect Veiler sometimes, if you don't open Ariana. Imperm is not great against it. A lot of the cards that people are playing right now are not great against Labyrinth, and I think that is one reason why I like the deck. It's going to be the lowest Tier 1, but I think if there was ever a time to play Furniture Lab, it's probably now, right? Because Furniture Lab was always kind of synergistic with playing your own hand traps. You're not super weak to your opponent's hand traps. I think that's kind of a good place to be right now. Mannadium, I'm gonna put in a similar spot to Infernoble. I think Mannadium is scary. I think Mannadium was a little bit of a better call a couple weeks ago. I think now that people have adapted and people are playing the hand traps necessary to stop it, maybe it's gotten a little bit worse. Maybe it's more towards Tier 2. Marincess and Mathmech, I kept these two because we're in a hand trap format, and those are two of the most notorious decks when it comes to playing hand traps. However, I still don't think these two really cut it for different reasons though. The reason why I don't think Mathmech is great right now is because you only have one circular and people are playing a million ways to stop you from getting it. If it had 3 circulars, I think we'd be talking. Well, we would be hating it here, but we would probably be talking. Like if the deck could hard open circular more often, because if you open circular, you have a really easy time playing through Ash, playing through one Imperm, one Veiler or whatever. then it'd be a playable deck, and I would not be liking it, but I would tell you, hey, yeah, this deck is scary. And Marincess has a different problem. Marincess is not bad against hand traps. The problem is I think Marincess doesn't do enough. It can play a lot of hand traps, like you hand trap your opponent a lot, and then you start playing, but what you're doing is like, it's not too scary. Like you are probably not killing your opponent. I don't even know if Marincess can do that. And so your opponent always gets another turn. And most decks just have better follow-up, and Marincess just doesn't do that, right? Marincess stops your opponent from playing and then doesn't do anything itself, I think. Like, that's the problem. The Mikanko deck. I think that deck is scary. I'm gonna put it in tier 2 though, because I think it has lost a little bit of its surprise factor. Like, I've seen a bunch of deck profiles, for example, where people said, yeah, I was worried about this deck, so I included this or that way to out the Acid Golem. There are ways to deal with the Acid Golem. It's also a little bit harder to pull it off through hand traps. The deck is still good, only because tier 2 is the second lowest tier on this tier list. Don't get me wrong, those decks are still playable. If you like this deck and you think it's a good meta call, go for it. Like, they are playable decks. They're completely fine for locals. They are fine for regionals. I personally probably wouldn't bring these to a YCS, but if you really wanted to, you could. And if you have a lucky day, you can still top with them. So like, keep that in mind, that even though I'm putting it into tier 2, that this is not a bad evaluation. This is still a good deck. Plants. Okay, you're probably gonna laugh at me because I'm from Europe, but I don't think the plant deck is in a good situation right now. I know, surprising, it's probably gonna win the next 3 YCSs back to back to back, undefeated, because I said that. But everyone is playing hand traps. There's just no way it's a good pick, right? We agree on that, right? We are in agreement that Rika is not good if everyone is playing 12 hand traps. Like, people are main decking Droll, people are main decking Nibiru, people are playing Ash, Veiler, Imperm left and right. There's just no shot I can give this deck a good evaluation right now. Even with the European field spell bonus, this deck just can't be good. There's just no way that it works, right? I'm not going to put it tier 3. I don't think it deserves that, but I just don't think it's a good pick right now. I'm probably going to be proven wrong with lightning speed at YCS Bologna. Like, someone is gonna go undefeated, win the event probably, and then people are gonna like clip this and I'm gonna look like a fool. But with all the logic in the world applied, I just don't see this deck being a good pick right now. Pearly, I think, is good. I think because people are moving away a little bit from Thrust into Herald of the Abyss in the main deck, your matchups game 1 are going to be a little bit stronger. Your Noir is more reliable in game 1 now. I like Pearly, especially the field spell can be a freaking insane card to open if everyone is playing Imperm and Veiler. Honestly, another thing that kind of benefits Pearly is that it's kind of hard to side deck cards for one specific matchups right now. The decks in tier 1 you definitely need to prepare for. The decks down here you probably want to be prepared for. The decks down here, ideally you want to have some plan for these as well. It's kind of hard to side deck specific cards for a matchup, and Pearly is one of the decks where generic cards are like okay against it but not insane. You kind of want to have cards that are specifically targeted at Pearly, like Xyz Encore, Spellbound, Book of Eclipse, Kaiju's, Herald of the Abyss. Those kind of cards are really good against Pearly, but I think they are less common right now than they used to be because there are so many different decks to cover, and Herald of the Abyss pretty much only works against one deck. So don't get me wrong, those cards are still here, especially because people seem to hate losing to Pearly. So don't expect to just win every game you get to summon a Noir. That's not what I'm saying. But overall, I think the popularity of specific answers to Pearly is going down a little bit. So I think Pearly is respectable. I think Pearly is looking good. We have Rescue Ace, which is, despite all the hand traps, I can't help but still put this like somewhere here, maybe even over Pearly. The simple logic would be, hey, people are playing hand traps because of Rescue Ace. That's why Rescue Ace is not as good anymore, right? And I agree, it's not as good anymore as it was for YCS Indianapolis, probably. The problem is the quality of hand traps, specifically against Rescue Ace. It kind of falls off a cliff once you reach a certain number of hand traps. Like Ash is good, Imperm is good, Veiler is good, maybe Mourner is all right. You could argue Nib and Droll are situational but could be okay. But after you like dedicate 9 or 12 main deck slots to hand traps, you're struggling to find more, especially ones that are generically good in the format, right? And the problem with that is that if you only play like 9 hand traps and then you open one of them, one hand trap I don't think is very likely to stop Rescue Ace, because one hand trap basically means if they have more than one starter, you're cooked. I'd say if you open 2 good hand traps, you're chilling against Rescue Ace, but it's hard to play enough good hand traps to consistently open 2. I would say the most common number of hand traps is 9, maybe 12, which is not super likely to draw multiples, especially 9. Like with 12, it's realistic to draw 2. With 9, it happens sometimes, but it's not super common. That is, I think, the one thing that keeps Rescue Ace in it is that you have a lot of ways to outplay one hand trap. Therefore, Rescue Ace is still really, really scary. When I say it's a gamble when you play against Rescue Ace, the same is also implied the other way around. When you're playing Rescue Ace, it's also a gamble. When you go first, you pretty much have to hope that your opponent doesn't open more hand traps than you open starters, or like the same number, right? Because if you open 1 starter, you lose to 1 hand trap. If you open 2 starters, you lose to 2 hand traps, which can all happen in this format. So Rescue Ace, out of all those decks, is probably the most gamble deck in the format, but a gamble doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It's just something that some people like to do it and some people like to not do it. Salamangreat, as much as it pains me to say it, it's probably here, and I'm already probably coping with that. It did top the YCS, but I'll say one thing that makes me very sad, and that is that the best version of Salamangreat is probably the one that aims to floodgate your opponent, which is cringe, but if you're being hit with that combo, you lose the game. Every single deck on this list, if they get Gozen Match weaseled, game's over. That is something. You know, the deck does have an auto win button going first. I think now with like 3 Gazelle, 3 Circle, Salamangreat of Fire, all that stuff, I think it's surprisingly good at playing through hand traps as well, outside of Nibiru, of course, which is a popular card, so Nibiru is gonna kill you every time. If Nibiru wasn't a thing, it'd probably be higher than that, but nah. Runic decks. I am sad to announce that I don't think Runic decks are in a great situation right now, simply because the format right now is very, very non-engine driven. If you go second with Runics, you pretty much only have, like, I want to say on average 6 non-engine slots, which usually it's not enough hand traps. We already established like drawing 1 board breaker against certain decks is just not going to cut it. I hate to say it, but I don't think Runic decks are good right now. The one thing that Runic Sprite versions have going for it is going first. These decks are monsters right now, because if you've ever played a Runic Sprite version, you know what I'm talking about. Hand traps mean nothing to you. You have a point. Droll is a good card against it. Shifter is also a good card against it, but some Runic versions have good ways to play around Droll by doing the stuff in the draw phase, and then you still end on Fountain plus some. With that being said, I'm gonna slot them somewhere in tier 2, and then the Fountain is meant to represent Runic Stun, but I'm just gonna throw it next to here. Like, Runic Stun, I guess, is as playable as ever. I have recently been theorizing about Sprite a little bit because of what I just said. Sprite used to be really, really good at playing through hand traps. The problem is, what do you really end on? What do you do going second? What secondary engine do you maybe use? You don't really have good toad lines anymore. Without Elf, I don't know. You don't have follow-up. I don't even know if you grind well in a hand trap game back and forth. Because of what I just said, I'm gonna throw it somewhere down here. The thing is, I don't know what version you would play. You would probably need to put a lot of work into it, and I haven't done that. Sword Soul is pretty bad, I think. One of those decks where you have to move on from, I think. Tearlaments is a deck that I find weird. My first feeling is, I don't really like the deck. It's not very appealing to me because it doesn't look super consistent. My second thought, on the other hand, though, is I'm hella scared of it. And whenever you're scared of a deck, that probably means something, right? Even though I don't like the kind of get it twisted mentality, I recognize that it's strong still. On top of that, it's also supposed to be good against hand traps, right? It doesn't ignore hand traps like, for example, a Runic Sprite deck would, but it always feels like Tearlament finds a way to play through your hand traps. I think it's a strong deck, probably here or here, but judging on its performance from YCS Richmond, I might even be here. So yeah, take it with a grain of salt. Because I don't like the deck as much, I haven't played it as much, but just from observing the meta trends, I can't help but think it's a solid pick right now. Unchained, I'm gonna put it here because I think it was for very good reason that it performed as well at YCS Richmond. Even though I do think it's probably the most solid and most powerful deck right now, I think all 5 of these in tier 1 have their own set of advantages and disadvantages. There are some scenarios where a deck like Pearly performs better than Unchained. There is also a world, like I said earlier, if people see these results from YCS Richmond and they go back to Talents and Thrust and move down on hand traps, then this entire situation could be swapped. It could look like this if people do that easily. But going off of the information that I have right now, like looking at the results from YCS Richmond, looking at the deck profiles from recent regionals, everyone is playing hand traps. And hand traps are not great against Unchained. Unchained is one of those decks that really benefits from hand trap formats because it has ways to play around them. One hand trap is never guaranteed to stop Unchained. Even two sometimes feel like they do nothing. Especially cards like Valor or Imperm feel like they are super gambly against the deck. If my interpretation of the current meta is correct, which is that people are still playing a lot of hand traps, then I think Unchained is the most solid pick out of these top 5. Last but not least, we have Vanquished Soul, which I'm gonna throw somewhere into tier 2. This might be personal bias. You guys know I love Vanquished Soul. It has good synergy with hand traps as well. The one thing that keeps me from putting Vanquished Soul higher is that most of the hand traps that are good in this format, unfortunately, just have the wrong attribute. It might seem like a small thing, but if that was different, if there were more good non-engine cards that had fire, dark, or earth attribute, we would be talking. I think then it would be better because Vanquished Soul is a deck that is carried by non-engine. Don't get me wrong, the Vanquished Soul engine is fun and good in grind games, but it needs non-engine to back it up. It's not powerful enough on its own. And unfortunately, the really good non-engine in the current format are not the right attributes to make the deck more consistent. For example, if a lot of fire non-engine would be good, the deck would be more consistent because you could more often get off your Jiao Long search, right? But like no fire non-engine is good right now outside of Ash. The one other thing is that it's one of the best decks for Fenrir, which is a huge deal. Fenrir is great in this format. We're going to talk about non-engine in a bit, but Vanquished Soul is one of the better decks for Fenrir. And when people go back and forth hand trapping each other, Fenrir is great. Those are the things that make me want to put Vanquished Soul like in tier 2. And that is it. I think this is a decent representation of the current format. Just to recap a little bit, the top 5 are like the solid picks of the format. Sometimes one of these can perform better than others because of the circumstances that we've talked about. In tier 1.5 here, they're kind of like the wild cards for me personally because I haven't tested them enough. And then everything down here is like a huge chunk of decks that are all playable if you really wanted to. And that's the format. As you can see, no tier 0. I mean, I could have just left it because I knew from the beginning I wouldn't put anything in here. I still think it's a good thing to keep it in just to showcase the fact that there is no clear best deck right now. There's a lot of development going on in the format, a lot of back and forth, a lot of like, okay, hand traps are going up, so Unchained Stonks are rising. Maybe now board breakers are going to go up, so Unchained Stonks are going to go down. That kind of thing. And there has just not been a clear solution that just is above all the rest, right? That's why I kept the tier 0 in there. If you watched this on YouTube, do me a huge favor and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment down below on how you liked the video. I hope it was helpful. If I missed your deck and you want to know what I think of it, leave a comment down below. As usual, I'm going to try to answer as many of them as possible and tell you what I think about your deck. Thank you for watching, and until next time, bye bye. Say goodbye to YouTube, Twitch chat, bye bye.